Hey everyone, this is Hafizullah Masoudi and you're watching from Code with Hafiz. I welcome you to the 10th video of this HTML series where we will discuss HTML forms. So first of all, you should know what are HTML forms. Well, an HTML form is used to collect user input which can be sent to a server for processing. So to define a form, we can use the form element to create an HTML form for user input. So the form element will be a container for different types of input fields or elements such as text fields, checkboxes, radio buttons, submit buttons, etc. So first let's declare a form element and then we will proceed to all possible input elements. So let's get back to our text editor, and first of all what I will do is I will comment our previous code. So let's comment it, and yeah, so let's remove this one, and now let's create our form element at the very top. So let's say form and let's close it, and that's all for the form. Now we can use the input element, which is the most used form element, and it can be displayed in many ways depending on the type attribute. So this means that we can have an input element with the type of text, radio, checkbox, submit, and button, etc. So let's create some input types of text for a single line text input. So for now, if we save our file and get back to the browser and refresh, we won't have anything, and that is because the form itself is only a container and is not being displayed in the browser. So keep that in mind. Now let's get back to the text editor, and to create some input fields, let's open our input element, and note that this element does not hold a closing tag, which means it does not have any content. So let's declare it as a text input field. So we can use the type attribute, which should equal to text, and for this element we can have ID. So let's say this one is name, and we can have the name attribute for it. So let's say it's for the name, and what we can do is create another one. So I will copy it and paste it again, and let's say this one is for the last name, and the ID should be last name also, and the type should be text. So let's save this and get back to our browser, and if we refresh, now you can see we have two input elements in which we can type anything we want. So guys, you can see we have created the input fields, but we don't have any way to recognize which input is for what data. So for this we have another element in forms, and that is the label element, and we can define a label for many form elements, and the label element is useful for screen reader users because the screen reader will read out loud the label when the user focus on the input element. And the label element also help the users who have difficulty clicking on very small regions such as radio buttons or checkboxes, because when a user clicks the text within the label element, it toggles the radio button or the checkbox too. So let's create some label elements. So let's get back to the text editor, and let's create first for the input of name. So let's open our label element, and this element has also a closing tag because it will hold some content. So inside here let's say name, and we have a very important attribute for the label element, which is the for attribute, and in here whatever we want to declare should match the ID of the input field to bind these two together. So let's say this one is for name, and what we can do is copy this one and paste it for the other input field. Now this one is, let's say, for last name, and in here let's say last name. And if we save this now, get back to the browser, refresh, now you can see we have our labels for each of the input field. Now next up we have radio buttons, which let a user to select one of a limited number of choices. So to show you this one, let's get back to the text editor, and what I will do is create some radio buttons. So let's create it at the very top. So first let's create an input field, and this time for the type what we can do is we can declare it radio, so it will be a radio button. So let's give it an ID, and let's say this one is HTML, and let's give it a name. So let's say for example language, and let's give it a value. So we have this value attribute also, which declares an initial value for the input field. So let's say this one is HTML, and what we can do is we can declare a label for this one also. So let's copy this label from here, and let's press some enters here, paste it. And you remember I told you that the ID of the label or the ID of the input should match the for attribute of the label to bind these two together. And let's say this one is for HTML. So let's copy this one and paste it a couple of times. So the next one should be, let's say, for CSS, and the value should hold CSS, and for the label let's say CSS, and for attribute let's say CSS, and the third one let's say JavaScript. For the name language is alright, and for the value let's say JavaScript, and for label let's also say JavaScript, and in the for attribute let's say JavaScript. Now let's save this, get back to our browser, and if we refresh, now you can see we have our 3 radio buttons, and you can see if I click on the label it will be selected, and it automatically goes because I have a meta tag for the refresh. And if I show you that one, and yeah, this is the refresh meta tag, which refreshes the page every 10 seconds. So that's for that reason. Now let's try to create some error in the for attribute of the label and show you something. So what I will do is, for example, for this HTML, let's say HTML, and if I save this and if I click on this, now you can see it's not selecting the radio button. So that's the reason always you must make sure that the for attribute value matches the ID of the input element. Now this one should be HTML. So this was about radio buttons. Now next up what we have is checkboxes, which lets a user to select 0 or more options of a limited number of choices. So to show you this one, what we can do is copy these radio buttons. So let's copy all of them and paste it here. So the only thing that we will change here is the type. So let's say this should be checkbox, and let's change these others also. And now if we save this and get back to the browser, refresh, well, let's put a brick also to see better. So I will put a brick here, and now if we refresh, yeah, now you can see we have our 3 checkboxes. So for the checkbox we can select one or more than one, but for radio buttons, yeah, these have the same IDs, so that's the reason they are selecting the same. So we have to change the IDs. So for this one, let's say HTML1, and it should be pasted in here. Let's say CSS1, and this should be pasted in here, and let's say JavaScript1. So I told you in our previous videos, or in one of the previous videos on IDs, that the ID should be unique. So for this reason it is recommended to always write the IDs unique. So let's get back to the browser, and if we refresh now it should work. You can see it's working. So next up what we have is the submit button, which defines a button for submitting the form data to a form handler. So a form handler is typically a file on the server with a script for processing input data, and it can be specified in the form's action attribute. Well, I won't cover how to handle form data in this series because that's something related to another programming language, for example PHP. So for now, just know that this is how you can submit a form to a specific file or URL to that file, where you can write some script to handle the data. So to show you this one, let's get back to our text editor and let's create a form submit button. So let's put a BR here first, and let's say input. So let's say input, and for this one type should be submit, and next up we have the value, which should be also submit. And for this to work in our form element, we have to declare the action attribute, which will point to a file which will be in the server. So for now, let's just only say /action.php. So let's save this and get back to the browser, and if I refresh, now you can see we have the submit button. So if we submit it, we won't have anything because the file couldn't be accessed, but in the URL you can see our data has been submitted to the to that URL, which is the action.php, and then we have the name and last name. So that's how it works. So to check this one if it works, let's get back to the text editor, and let's say for the input field of name we want an initial value, so let's say John, and for this one, or for the last name, we also want a value which will be Doe. So let's save this, get back to the browser, and this time if we submit it, well, let's submit it, and you can see in the URL the name is equal to John and the last name equals to Doe. So this is how you can create a submit input field. So let's get back to our text editor, guys, and in here you can notice that I have used the name attribute for input fields, and that is because if you omit or remove the name attribute from these input fields, the value of input field will not be sent at all. So keep this in mind to always declare the name attribute for your input fields. Now to send the radio button and checkbox value also, well, let's name the first one language 1. So in here let's say language 1, and for this one also, and for this one language is alright. So let's save this, get back to the browser, and this time let's select some. So I will select these and let's submit it, and now you can see in the URL that for language 1 we have HTML, and for language 1 we have CSS, and for language we have only CSS, and for name we have John, and for last name we have Doe. So you can see the name attribute is pretty important, and if you remove the name attribute from the input fields, the data won't be sent. So keep this in mind. So let's get back to our text editor, and for the action attribute, you already know that it is defined to perform an action, and for the form element it will perform an action when the form is submitted. So usually the form data will be sent to a file on the server when the user clicks on the submit button. So if you omit or remove the action attribute, it will be by default the current page. So to show you this one, let's remove it, and if we save this, get back to the browser, and if I submit it, you can see it submitted the data to the current page, and now we can see our input fields in the URL. So let's close this. So it's targeting all the submissions to a blank page, and that's all because of the meta tag. So if I show you, and in here we have this target, so what we can do is we can comment it. So let's comment this, and let's close the comment, and if I save this now, get back to the browser, refresh, now if I submit it, now you can see it's not opening a blank page. So that was because of the meta tag. Now of course we can declare a target for handling the form submission too. So the values that it can take are underscore blank, underscore self, which is the default one, underscore parent, underscore top, or some file name. So to show you this one, let's get back to the text editor, and for the form, let's say target, and let's say it should equal to a blank page. And if I save this, get back to the browser and refresh, and now if I submit, you can see it opened a blank page and our data is being submitted. Now next up, what we have is the method attribute, which specifies the HTTP method to be used when submitting the form. So the form data can be sent as URL variables with a get method, or as HTTP post transaction with post method. And if you do not declare the method attribute, the default that will be used is the get method. So to show you this one, let's get back to the text editor, and in here we can say a method, and for this one we have either a get or we have post. So let's declare it get, and if we save this, get back to the browser, and if we submit it, you can see it's getting the data in the URL. And if we make it post, so let's get back to the text editor and make this one post. And if I save this, get back to the browser, refresh, and let's try to submit it, and now you can see it submitted the data, but we don't have the data visible in the URL. So that's the main difference between the get and the post method. So you noticed while using the get method for forms, the data will be appended to the URL, and it will be usually in name and value pairs. And always try to never use get to send sensitive data, because it will be visible in the URL, and the length of the URL is also limited, so you cannot send more than 2048 characters. And the get method can be useful where a user only wants to bookmark the result, or for non-secure data, for example query strings in Google or etc. And regarding the post method will append the data inside the body of the HTTP request, which means it will not be shown in the URL, and the post method has no size limitations, so it can be used to send large amounts of data. And in contrast to the get method, the post method cannot be bookmarked. So keep this in mind. So you must always use the post method if the form data contains sensitive or personal information. Now next up, what we have is the autocomplete attribute for the form element. So we can declare it directly in the form element. So let's say autocomplete, and it can be either a true or false. So we can declare its value either on or off. So by default it is on, and if you want to make it off, you can declare off in here, and if you want to make it on, you can do that too. So to make it on, let's get back to the browser, and if I remove this and if I type J, you can see it's recommending some data. And if we make it off, so let's say off, and if we save this, refresh now, and if I now press J, you can see it's not recommending anything. So that's how you can use autocomplete on or off. Now next up we have the no validated attribute, which is a boolean attribute, and this means if you declare this attribute, it will be true, otherwise it's false by default. And this attribute specifies that the form data should not be validated when submitted. So to declare this one, let's get back to the text editor, and in here we can use no validate, and this will tell the form or the browser, if we submit this form, the data or the input fields should not be validated. Now next up, what we have is the select element, which defines a drop down list. So to show you this one, let's press enter here, and first of all let's create a BR, and then let's create it at the top. So in here let's first create a label, and you can see we can create a label for almost all input or HTML form elements. So let's say this one is for choose a car, and next let's create our select element. So let's say select, and let's close this tag. So select, and inside the select element what we have is the options. So let's create one first, so let's close it also, and this element holds content. So for example, let's say Corolla, and it also have a value. So for the value, let's say Corolla, and I think it should be 2Ls, so let's say Corolla. And next up, what we can do is copy this option to create some more, and for this one, let's say Mercedes, and this should be Mercedes, and next let's say Audi, and let's say Audi, and let's say Ford and Ford. Well, for the values, yeah, we have each of the values. Now if we save this, and before that we go to the browser, let's also declare a name for the select, because you remember I told you you must always declare the name attribute for your input fields. So for this one, let's say cars, and let's also declare an ID attribute, so this one should be also cars, and let's also declare a for attribute for here for the label, so which should be cars. Now let's save this, get back to the browser, and if I refresh, now you can see we have our nice drop down list for which we can select each of the options. Now by default the first one will be selected, and if you wanna change this functionality, you can use an attribute for this. So for the options, we have an attribute of selected. So what this will do is select the one that we want. So you saw that the Corolla was selected by default, so let's declare the selected field in Audi to see if this works. So let's get back to the browser, refresh, and now you can see Audi is selected. Now next up, what we have is the size attribute, which we can declare for the select element. And first of all, let's declare it. So for the select element, I will say size attribute, and for the value, let's say 3. And if we go to the browser now you can see the visible values are only 3, and if we scroll down, now we have the 4th value. So this is how the size attribute works. Now next up, what we have is the multiple attribute, which will convert this single select element to a multiple select element. So to show you this one, let's get back to the text editor, and in here what I will do is declare the multiple attribute, and this will convert this select element to a multiple select element. And while we are here, let's remove the refresh meta tag, because that's annoying. So I will cut it from here and paste it inside this comment in case I need it in the future. So let's save this, get back to the browser, refresh, and if you want to select multiple values, you can hold the control button, and now you can see we can select multiple ones. And if you want to deselect, hold the control and click on one of them or one of the selected ones. So this is how the multiple attribute works to create a multiple select element. Now next up, we have the text area element, which defines a multi-line text input field or a text area. So to show you this one, let's get back to the text editor, and in here let's just scroll down, and I will put a BR first. And to create a text area, let's create or open the text area tag, and let's close it also. So I will close it here, and this tag this element has the closing tag also, because it holds some content. So in here, let's say this is some data for the text area, and for this element what we have is the name. So for the name, let's say example, and next up what we have is the rows attribute for the text area, which will define the visible rows. So in here, let's say 10, and next up what we have is the calls attribute, which stands for columns, and it is also the visible columns. So for this one, let's say 30. And if I save this, get back to the browser, and if I refresh, now you can see we have our nice text area. So let's get back to the text editor, guys, and in here you can see I have used the rows attribute and the calls attribute. So the rows attribute can be used to specify the visible number or lines in a text area, and the calls attribute can be used to specify the visible width of a text area. Well, of course you can use CSS also to define the size of the text area. Now next up what we have is the button element, which defines a clickable button. So to show you this one, let's put a BR first here, and then let's open the button tag, and let's close it, so like this. And now we have the text of the button. So for this one, let's say click me, and for the button type, we'll always remember to declare the type for the button, and you can have for example the type button itself, or for example you can have a submit button also. So let's make this one a type of button, and let's declare an on-click event to this. So we will write some JavaScript code, and let's alert something to the browser like this. So let's say hello world, and now let's save this, get back to the browser, and let's refresh. And now if we click on it, now you can see it says hello world. So this is how you can create a button. Now while using the button element, I told you that always specify the type attribute for the button, because different browsers may use different default types for the button element. Now next up what we have is the field set and legend elements. So to show you this one, let's get back to the text editor, and what I will do is put an HR here, and let's create first of all the field set element. So field set, and let's close this tag, so field set. And inside here what we have first of all is for example the legend itself. So let's say legend, and then close it. Well, I will describe or explain everything in a moment. First of all, I will write the code. So let's say personal information, and what I will do is now copy the two input fields. So let's just scroll down, and I will copy the name and the last name. So let's copy this, and let's paste it inside the field set. So let's also indent it a little bit for clean code, and let's also bring our button. So let's just scroll down, and I will copy this one also and paste it here. So let's save this, get back to the browser, and let's refresh. And now you can see we have a nice box here, and this box has a caption which is personal information, and the box itself holds the labels and the input fields, including the submit button. So you can see that the field set element is used to group the related data in forms, and the legend element defines a caption for the field set element. So this is how you can use field set element along with the legend element. Now next up what we have is the data list element, which specifies a list of predefined options for an input element, and users will see a drop down list of the predefined options as they input the data. And the list attribute of the input element must refer to the ID attribute of the data list, so to bind them together. Now to show you an example of this one, let's get back to the text editor, and in here first of all let's remove the no validate and autocomplete. So I will remove them. Well, let's create an HR, so to completely separate the code from the bottom. So first of all guys, let's create an input field, and in here let's declare a list for it. So this is how you can use the data list element. So you have to declare a list for the input field, and let's say this should be browsers for example. And now we can create our data list. So let's open the data list tag, and let's close it. So data list, and inside here what we have is some options So let's copy one from the select element and let's paste it here. Well, for the value, let's say for example Internet Explorer, and in here let's say Internet Explorer, and what I will do is copy this, so paste it a couple of times, and for the next one let's say Firefox, let's say Firefox, and the third one let's say Chrome, so in here let's say Chrome, and the fourth one let's say Opera, and in here let's say Opera, and for this one let's say Safari. So guys, I noticed that I have written everything as we did for the select input element, but for the data list what we need to do is remove the closing tag, because for the data list we don't have options with content. So let's remove them, but we do have the options opening tag with the value. So next up what we have to do is give this data list an ID, and the ID should match the list value, so it should be browsers. So let's paste this here, and if we save this now, get back to the browser, and if I refresh, and you can see now we have this arrow here, and if we click on it, now you can see it shows some of the suggestions. So if we select one, now it won't show anything else rather than the selected value. So if we refresh again and click on it, now you can see we have some predefined select options. Now next up what we have is the output element, which represents the result of a calculation, like one performed by a script. So to show you this one, let's get back to the text editor, and in here let's press enter, and first let's create an HR, so to separate the code. And what we can do is in here we can create some input fields, so let's create one, and for the type of this input field let's say range, and this is another example of input fields, so we can have a type of range also. So for the ID let's say for example A, and for the name let's say for example A, and for the value let's say 50, and next up, or let's say in here 0, and after this let's say 100 plus, so plus, and let's create another input. So I will copy this one, so let's copy it and paste it here, and for this one value should be 50, this should be, the name should be B, ID should be B, and instead of range we can use another type of input field, which is number. So after this what we can do is in here let's say equals to, and now we want the output of this one, so let's say output, and let's also close it, so output, and for this output let's give it a name, so it should be X, and let's say for, and it is for A and B. And for the forum let's declare an input event, so in here we can say on input, so it should equal to, let's say x dot value, and x dot value should equal to parse integer. So don't worry about this, I just want to show you that how this output element works. So let's say a dot value, and then we want to add it, so let's say parse integer. Well, this parse integer is used to convert a number to an integer, so that's what it's used for. So in here let's say b dot value, and that's all. So if we save this now and get back to the browser and let's refresh, and now if I change this, well, it's not working. So let's see what is the problem. Let's get back to the text editor, and yeah, I think I know what is the problem. So in here this is correct, but in here we don't have a plus, it should be an equal sign. So let's save this now, get back to the browser, refresh, and now it should work. As you can see, it's working. So the output is showing the result of this on input that we have declared for the form element without writing any other JavaScript code. So this is how the output element works. So guys, these were all the possible elements you can have in an HTML form, and related to the input element types, note that you can have an input type of button, checkbox, color, date, time local, email, file, and a hidden input field, an image, month, number, password, radio buttons or radio input fields, range input fields, reset input fields, search, submit, tell, text, time, URL, and week. So these are all the types that you can use with the input element. So I won't cover everything, but you can search for input types in the Google and you will get all the list of possible input types in the Google. So next up, what we have is the input attribute fields. For example, we have used the value attribute, which specifies an initial value for an input field, and in here you can see for the input we have value which is 50, and for this number input we have another value attribute which is also 50. And if you scroll down, you can see for the option we also have the value attribute which holds the value of that specific option. And if we scroll down, for the select element we also have the value attribute for the option which also holds the initial value or the specific value for that specific option. Now next up, what we have is the read only attribute. So to show you this one, for example, let's first of all create another input, or I will copy one from the below. So let's copy this input with the label, and let's put an HR first, so to separate the code, and let's paste our input element. And for this one, let's declare a read only attribute, so read only. And if we go to the browser now, refresh, now you can see it's only read only, and we cannot change the content of the input element. So the read only attribute specifies that an input field is read only and cannot be modified. However, a user can tap to it and highlight it and copy the text from it, but you cannot modify its value. So keep this in mind. Now next up, what we have is the disabled attribute, which specifies that an input field should be disabled and is unusable or unclickable. Now note that a disabled input will not be sent when submitting the form, so keep this in mind. So to declare an input field disabled, let's get back to the text editor, and instead of read only, let's say disabled. And now if we get back to the browser and refresh, now you can see its color has been changed or dimmed, and now you can see we cannot even click on it. So that's how a disabled input field looks like. Now next up, what we have is the size attribute, which specifies the visible width in characters of an input field, and the default value for the size is 20 characters. Now note that the size attribute will only work with input types of text, search, tell, URL, email, and password, while other types of input fields will not work. So to show you this one, let's get back to the text editor, and let me remove the disabled now. So let's declare a size attribute for this, and let's say this one should be 50 characters. So if we save this, get back to the browser and refresh, you can see its width has been changed, and now we have a longer input type of text element. Now next up, what we have is the multiple attribute, which can only be used with input types of email and file, and this attribute allows a user to enter more than one value in an input field. So to show you an example of this one, let's get back to the text editor, and let me create another input field. So let's put an HR here, and in here let's create an input field with a type of file. So the name should be, let's say, files, because it will be a multiple, and let's give it an ID of files, and let's say multiple, and let's close the input field. Now I will copy the label from here, so let's copy this and paste it here. So in here let's say select files, and for this one let's say files. So let's save this, get back to the browser, refresh, and if you click on it, well, let's go to the desktop and let's go to HTML projects, images, and now you can see one is selected. And if we hold the control and select another one, you can see we can select multiple files. So if we open it, now you can see it says 3 files selected. So this is how the multiple select works, and keep it in mind that you can use the multiple attribute only for the email and file type of input fields. Now next up, what we have is the placeholder attribute, which specifies a short hint that describes the expected value of an input field. And note that this attribute only works with input types of text, search, URL, tell, email, and password. So to show you an example of this one, let's get back to the text editor and let me copy this one. So let's copy the HR also, and let's paste it here. So let's indent it also. Now let's make the type password, and this should be password, for password, and for the ID let's say password, and for the name let's say password also. And we don't want any value for this, and also the size, so let's remove it, but we do want the placeholder. So let's say placeholder, we should say enter password. And if we save this, get back to the browser, refresh, now you can see it has a placeholder, and if we type on it, the placeholder goes away, and now we see our input values in the input field. So this is how the placeholder works. Now next up, what we have is the required attribute, which specifies that an input field is required and must be filled out before submitting the form. And this attribute works with input types of text, search, URL, tell, email, password, date pickers, numbers, and a checkbox, radio, and file input fields. So to show you an example of this one, let's get back to the text editor, and for this input field let's declare a required attribute, so required. And now if we get back to the browser and let's refresh, and if I now try to submit, you can see it's saying please fill out this field, which means this field is required now. Now next up, what we have is the step attribute that specifies the legal number intervals for an input field. So the step attribute works with input types of number, range, date, date time local, month, time, and week. So to show you an example of this one, let's get back to text editor, and if we scroll down, we have this input type of number. So for this one, let's say step, which should equal to, for example, let's say .01, and what this will do is create 2 extra fields after the decimal itself. So it will convert the number to the decimal. So let's get back to the browser, and if we refresh now, and where is that input field? Yeah, in here you can see now we have this part of the decimal. So this is how it works. And if we declare it 3, so let's get back to text editor and for example make this a 3, and let's get back to the browser, refresh, and now it will be only 3. So if I make it 99, so you can see it's minusing 3. So let's say it should be 1, and now you can see it's 2 and 5, and now added 3 more, 8, and 3 more, 11, and now 3 more 14. So this is how it works, guys. Now note that input restrictions are not foolproof, and JavaScript provide many ways to add illegal input, and to safely restrict input fields it must also be checked by the receiver, which is the server itself. Now next up what we have is the autofocus attribute, which specifies that an input field should automatically get focus when the page is loaded. So to show you this one, let's get back to the text editor, and let's suppose we want this password field to be autofocused. So in here we can just say autofocus, and if I save this, get back to the browser, refresh, now you can see we are autofocused on the password field. So if we refresh the page, our cursor is automatically in the password input field. Now if you want to check out more about HTML input attributes, you can search in the Google for HTML input attributes, and you can see all of them in there. Now finally we have the HTML input form attributes. For example, the form attribute, which specifies the form that the input element belongs to, and the value of the form attribute must be equal to the ID attribute of the form, so to bind the two together. So to show you an example of this one, let's get back to the text editor, and first of all let's comment everything here, so to show you this one clearly. And let's scroll down. Well, let's remove this from here so it holds all the code. Now in here what I will do is create another form, so let's create one, and let's close the tag, so form, and for the form action, let's say for example action.php, and let's give this form an ID, so let's say form1, and inside the form let's declare some input fields. So I will copy, for example, let's say these input fields with the input type of submit. So let's copy this and paste it here. Well, let's remove the one and leave only one input with the label. So next up, suppose we have an input field outside the form. So in here let's copy this one and paste it here. Well, let's also indent it, and this one is, let's say, last name, so let's say last name. And what do you think if we submit this form? Well, it will only submit the value of this input field which is inside the form. So to show you this one, let's refresh and let's submit it, and you can see it's only sending the name, which is John, but it's not sending the value of the last name. So to fix this, we can just pass another attribute in here, which is the form attribute that I told you, and we can equal this to the ID of the form, which is form1. So let's paste it here, and now what do you think will happen? Well, let's get back to the browser and let's get back to our project, and let's refresh, and now if I submit it, you can see now we have the name and we also have the last name. So this is how the form attribute works. Now next up what we have is the form ink type attribute, which specifies how the form data should be encoded when submitted, and this is only for forms with method post. Now this method will override the ink type attribute that can be declared directly in the form element. Now the form ink type attribute works with input types submit and image. So to show you this one, let's get back to the text editor, and first of all let me show you the ink type that can be declared on the form element. So in here we can declare an ink type or encoding type, which can be multiport. So let's say multiport slash form hyphen data. So this is how you can declare a ink type or encoded type, and I told you that this can be only used for input types of submit and image. So whenever you want to send an image with the form, you have to declare this attribute. So keep this in mind. And to show you the other way, so let's remove this. And the other way is that we, for example, press enter here and create an input field, and let's say the type of this one should be submit, because we want to submit this. And then we want to say form ink type, so form ink type, which should equal to multiport and slash form hyphen data, and then we have the value for it. So inside the value, let's say submit as a multiport, so multiport slash form hyphen data. So this is the other way that you can send the form ink or encoded type. So keep this in mind. So guys, we can also declare the form method type like this and send it along with the form, or the form target attribute also like this, and we can do all the attributes that comes with the form. For example, this action, so we can do this one also like this. So that's everything about the forms. And if you wanna find more about this, you can search for HTML input form attributes in the Google, where you can find more information about HTML forms. Now this was everything for today, and this being done, our video has come to an end, and I hope you enjoyed watching the video. And if so, don't forget to give the thumbs up and a nice comment also. And if you are new to this channel, don't forget to subscribe too if you want more videos like this. So thanks for watching. See ya in the next video.